I'm very, very honoured to introduce our first keynote speaker, Elelwani Ramugondo. Dr. Elelwani Ramugondo is professor at the University of Cape Town. She worked as a clinician in rural South Africa and in the United States of America during the 1990s. She was head of occupational therapy at UCT from 2010 to 2013. Following the fall of the Rhodes statue at UCT, she served for a year as special advisor on transformation to the Vice-Chancellor. She continues to serve at institutional level as chair of the Academic Freedom Committee and co-chair of the Curriculum Change Working Group. Her scholarship on intergenerational play led to the conceptualization of occupational consciousness, informed by liberation philosophy and coloniality as an aspect of Western-led modernity. This has laid groundwork for several doctoral studies adopting a decolonial approach to scholarship. Ramugondo has published several peer-reviewed articles and chapters in books. She is currently co-editing a book on Southern perspectives of occupational therapy concepts. Her presentation today is called Healing Work, Intersections for Decoloniality. I first met Elelwani in 2004, and I am so excited to listen to what she has to share with us today. Please welcome Elelwani.
Morning, everyone. And thank you, Marilyn, for that generous introduction. How does one prepare for a keynote address for the World Federation of Occupational Therapy Congress? So for my part, I looked up clips that I could find on YouTube. What I found very interesting were speeches by activists like Marlene Leroux and some world leaders. I was also hoping to find keynote addresses from WFOT congresses that have been held previously, but I was not lucky, so I'm hoping things will be different next time. I even got to look at the sermon by the Bishop Michael Carey, whose sermon has left many of us talking. But after all of that, I thought, to be safe, I'd rather just be myself. It is a great privilege to speak after such a stunning performance by Indoni Dance Arts and Leadership Academy, and there is no more I can add to what Marilyn Patterson has already said. So we do hope that you will look them up and learn more about what they do for the youth of this country. Colleagues, I give this keynote address within 2 months after we buried Mam Winnie Madikizela Mandela, an iconic leader of our times, who demonstrated through her entire life that true courage finds full expression when youth from the oppressed masses of our nation are not seen as a problem, but that working with them instead is key towards total emancipation. I dedicate this talk to her. I also bring into our imagination an elder in our profession, Professor Ruth Watson, who passed away a day after my birthday on the 18th of July 2014. Without Ruth and the great foresight she had in laying the foundation of occupational science scholarship in South Africa, I simply would not be here giving this talk. I know my colleagues at the University of Cape Town, as well as my dear mentors, Dr. Lindsay Nichols and Professors Dele Emerson, Diane Parham, Liz Townsend, and Claire Hawking will attest to this. Recently, we lost two dear colleagues, Vivian Alice here in South Africa, and Sylvia Sanz Victoria from Spain. I ask that we take a moment of silence now to honor their lives. I want to thank my colleagues at universities and both the private and public sectors for putting my name forward as someone who could speak on this platform in a manner that would do justice to our work in South Africa. Of course, there would be no such platform from which to speak without international delegates from all over the occupational therapy world. Thank you for trusting us when we assured you that there will be water for everyone during your visit. Thank you, especially to those of you who came here to give me personally courage of voice to say what needs to be said. I have deep gratitude to my family, Makuru, Frank, my husband, and our two children, Masana and Isha. Thank you for being you and always keeping me sane and deeply grounded. I love you. I want to make a special mention of students, both at undergraduate and postgraduate levels. I learn a lot from you every day. And to the PhD candidates I've had the privilege to mentor or continue to mentor, and those whose work I've reviewed as an external examiner, I want to say this, that I would not know the worth of my contribution in occupational therapy and in African scholarship within the academy broadly without you. Colleagues, key words to the topic I chose to speak on in this paper are healing, decoloniality, and intersections. I want to kick off by focusing your attention on healing. Later, I will attend to decoloniality and then conclude with examples for intersections that are aimed at decoloniality or healing work. Healing for me is a concept that is imbued with many metaphors. Water, for instance, is a very strong metaphor, but I'm going to choose blood instead for that purpose in this paper. Blood is a powerful metaphor for healing because if we ever speak of poisoned blood, then we know that this has a bearing on future generations. Future generations will not be safe until this blood is healed and the poison can no longer be passed on. Poisoned blood on the African continent, of course, brings to mind HIV and AIDS and the way this disease continues to ravage our communities. Healing this blood is therefore an important investment for future generations. When I talk about healing in this paper, it is in the sense that must be compared to removing poison from this blood as metaphor. This is healing that will impact many generations to come. I will park this metaphor for now and reflect a bit first on the impact our profession has had in the world so far and flag the limitations that I see in its healing work. Occupational therapy as a profession has an indisputable and impressive track record of enabling occupational engagement and participation for individuals and groups with impairments or disabilities by addressing performance components or adapting environments. This track record is often buried within clinical records that are kept in departments, but it is also alive in stories that those who have benefited from occupational therapy continue to tell all over the world. Systematic reviews that have looked at the efficacy of the profession have shown the benefits of comprehensive occupational therapy for the elderly with stroke or rheumatoid arthritis. One of the most exciting recent evidence that has been long overdue is that a sensory integration program can lead to significant improvement in gross and fine motor skills for children with autism, allowing them to become more independent and to participate in everyday activities. Independent participation in activities alone, however, does not capture fully what many of us have grown to appreciate about human occupation, a core concept to our profession. Occupational therapy, as both a human science and a health science, appreciates the complexity of human occupation as a transactional experience, and that human beings hold power in impacting their health through what they do in the world. Theorists in occupational science have additionally, in recent years, called for contextually situated practice, arguing that human occupation itself is contextually situated. Impact in occupational therapy, and a major keyword in our Congress theme, must be assessed with this understanding in mind. My main contention, therefore, in this paper is that it is in unpacking context and addressing it meaningfully where occupational therapy has shown some limitations in its healing work. Context includes but goes beyond the immediate physical environment, as well as socioeconomic and cultural conditions and practices at micro levels. Fundamental in understanding context is history, or history, if you like. This history must be understood in terms of the local situation as well as global histories. Marlene has already referred to this earlier, a local situation which we cannot deny in South Africa, which is the fact that we are one of the most unequal societies in the world. This situation, however, does not exist in a vacuum. One of the most poignant observations about gross economic inequality made by one of our local political analysts, Somadoda Fikeni, borrowing from Declan Burke, a writer and former Irish Times journalist, is that the world essentially is a crime scene, a product of slavery and theft. It is on the back of transnational slavery and land theft, which in turn enabled cheap labor, that we can speak of modernity today. This, colleagues, is our shared global history. Major cities in the world and rails for global trade were built by slaves. Mining industries with large global networks that continue to date benefited from stolen land, with the dispossessed forced into cheap labor. A prominent example in Southern Africa is Cecil John Rhodes, who in 1895, as Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, introduced through legislation a tax to force Africans off their tribal land into cheap wage labor for his diamond mining largesse, which benefited the crown. Another current and rising global phenomenon is that of the prison industrial complex, which is sustained by high unemployment rates and shrinking social welfare, forcing poor people into petty crime for survival. Like slavery and mining through cheap labor, the prison industrial complex is a business in itself and depends on the continued dispossession of marginalized population groups and rising economic inequality. It is for this reason that people of color and poor white people make up the largest numbers of our populations in prisons globally. Prisons and ill health in South Africa and elsewhere in the world go hand in hand. Many of our young people get infected with HIV or are exposed to tuberculosis while incarcerated. Youth from the oppressed masses are first deemed a problem, then incarcerated, and then condemned to premature death. Instead of seeing all our youth as the problem, we need to look at the contextual factors that lock them into a world of crime. Angela Davis, in this regard, notes very poignantly, and I quote, "The message we receive from politicians and from the interminable series of crime programs on television is that we need not be afraid of unemployment, homelessness, the deterioration of conditions in poor communities. They endlessly suggest that we need not be afraid of war and the environmental degradation caused by business and military operations, but we should be afraid of crime and those who are represented as its most likely perpetrators." Close quote. When we speak of impact in occupational therapy, we have to think about what this could mean for populations that carry the stereotype of the likely perpetrator and those that are deliberately driven out of the city through imposed poverty when basic commodities like water become unaffordable. The main argument I wish to advance in this paper is that as a profession, our impact must be felt through healing, attested to by real communities. I also want to suggest that communities who are marginalized will never feel our impact as occupational therapists unless we find partners to work with in decolonial ways. Gross economic inequality, as an ongoing and dehumanizing consequence of colonialism, racism, and a global capitalist neoliberal agenda, can therefore not be ignored as part of contextually situated occupational therapy practice and healing work. This is where it becomes important to speak about debility. I use the word debility in this paper in a manner that was described by Julie Livingston in her attempt to illustrate the social, economic, moral, and experiential complexity of this concept. Livingston uses case studies in Botswana as exemplars to illustrate this complexity. In her analysis, she sketches debility as a condition which is marked by deep historical changes in community and personhood and reflected in the redefined meanings of aging and able-bodiedness. The epistemological and moral questions around debility emerge when bodily norms are profoundly disrupted and when people have to learn to manage bodily misfortune in a rapidly changing world. Debility, in this sense, encompasses disability, but also goes beyond it. Although there has been scholarly efforts to view disability from both social and biomedical perspectives, diagnosis appears to still play a central role in defining disability. Diagnosis, as dependent on the expert to locate in the body and name, immediately divides people between those with a disability and those without. This is not to say that there is no place for diagnosis. Of course there is, as it can play a crucial role in allowing access to appropriate care and services for those who have impairments. Debility, however, allows for more permeability and mobility in and out of a sense of personhood, regardless of the presence or absence of impairment. As Livingstone observes, debility, the impairment, lack or loss of certain bodily abilities is on one level a profound challenge to personhood. But debility also has a history, in the sense that impairment and disfigurement often arise out of a particular historical juncture. For example, the rising of mines and mining accidents, wars, or violence in societies that may not even be at war in the military sense. This understanding of debility gives us insight into people's sense of historical experience and changing assumptions about personhood and self. As a consequence of flawed systems of healing, economics, and politics, debility at a collective or societal level leads to fundamental changes in the ways in which people see each other and care for one another. Using the 1930s as a central point of reference, Livingstone tracks how labor migration and colonial medicine played an important role in how debility came about in Botswana. Livingstone describes how industrial capital and Western-led modernization redefined the notion of success such that productive and procreative vitality, madi, or blood in English, of Tswana communities was replaced by money, madi, the new currency of reproduction and health. Imposed migrancy saw youths prioritize economic power before community-level responsibilities. Madi once meant blood, but in the 1940s came to mean mostly money. Note a return to the metaphor, blood, which requires healing. Along with this forced migrancy, bungaka, Tswana traditional healing was shifted out of the center of public health. This role was taken over instead by mission doctors and colonial medicine. In this context, known safety nets and moral economies were tested to the limit. The influx of a particular web of Western institutions, ideas, and capital brought about an uneasy and bifurcated sense of personhood, where the development of a liberal sense of individualism that values personal efforts, successes, and status is suddenly pitched against the socialized sense of the person whose sense of self is located in and continually produced through his or her relations with others. I hope you are hearing Ubuntu in this. Profound statements about disability emerged during Livingstone's fieldwork And this came from older people in Botswana mentioning that they never thought of disability and that Dihole, or disabled people, came with independence. Also very telling in Livingstone's descriptions of debility in Botswana is the pathologization of the womb in the popular imagination. In the quest for diagnosis, along with explanations for new conditions that emerged, some causes to children's illnesses and disabilities were suddenly linked to women's birthing processes or caregiving approaches. In response, some women began to hide debilitated persons away from the public gaze. With the withdrawal of colonial administrators and the beginning of independence in 1966, instead of sovereignty returning to Botswana people and local chiefly power reconstituting itself in rebuilding traditional safety nets and moral economies, the opposite occurred. National bureaucracy, augmented by the discovery of diamonds and international aid agencies advising the state, took charge over welfare. Development in this way became a combination of national promise and cultural disarray. Tswana historical imagination thus envisions the past with deep nostalgia as a land of lost institutions and relationships. Here, Madi, that is blood, no longer flows, but collects in toxic quantities in narrowly defined persons, leading to pollution of the social body and the individuals who constitute it. To me, this description of debility by Livingstone is not unique to Botswana. What is described here could easily be South Africa, all of Africa, and indeed many parts of our conquered world. Underlying Livingstone's case narrative of debility pertaining to Botswana is the civilizing project of the colony by empire. This brings me to the birth of our profession, occupational therapy, and the conquered people that served as trigger. The historical roots of our profession can be traced back to the settlement house movement, which originated in England in the late 1800s. This was a mechanism of supporting poor people through social and cultural integration. With heavy migration of various conquered people or distressed refugees, largely from Europe, entering the United States of America between 1890 and 1910, the settlement house movement was translated to the United States, with Hull House being founded in Chicago. Hull House continues to play a significant role as part of the archival memory of the birth of occupational therapy, at least in the United States of America. Yet, issues of poverty, immigration, and assimilation in the United States and anywhere else in the world will outlive Hull House. Debility, anywhere in the world, just like in Botswana, finds expression in the intersections of history, economics, politics, race, gender, and sexuality. As occupational therapists and one of the many so-called helping professions, we ought to ask ourselves difficult questions about whom and what we are helping to integrate into society in our individual and collective work. In what ways are we abating coloniality and debility through the integration of conquered people? In what ways are we continuing with the civilizing project? Whom are we civilizing, and from what into what? The atomizing and individualistic approach to health in colonial medicine that Livingstone unearths has similarly been critiqued in occupational therapy literature. Work by myself and Cronenberg in invoking Ubuntu as an ontic ethic and philosophy through which to understand collective occupation as potentially a humanizing or dehumanizing practice is a case in point. This paper argues that occupational therapy as contextually situated practice may be well placed to advance healing work or decoloniality in ways that not only benefit individuals or groups, but can impact society. But exactly what is this decoloniality? My reflections on decoloniality are drawn from a range of decolonial thinkers and activists who are generating what Sendu Hira, a Surinamese economist and historian, calls the third narrative of liberation. This third narrative is an alternative to liberalism and Marxism, these two having shown limitations in how they deal with collective historical oppression and systemic racism alongside classism, respectively. Ndlovu Gacheni, one of our very own local decolonial thinker and scholar, refers to decoloniality as a long-standing political and epistemological movement that is aimed at the liberation of ex-colonized people from global coloniality. In doing so, Ndlovu Gacheni and others delineate the notion of coloniality along three concepts: coloniality of power, coloniality of knowledge, and coloniality of being. Coloniality of power highlights the asymmetrical matrix of power that persists beyond the withdrawal of colonial administrators from the colonies and results in unequal nation states that are different along historical, imperial, and non-imperial lines. This concept reveals the extent to which colonization laid the foundation for the continuous subjugation of ex-colonized people and how decoloniality, its opposite, requires the realignment of power between nation states such that self-determination and collective self-reliance can be lived locally and felt globally for all, not just for parts of North America, Europe, or China. As we saw with the case of Botswana, development facilitated by international aid agencies and state-sponsored national bureaucracy did not quite allow for self-determination and collective self-reliance. Coloniality of knowledge describes the ways in which endogenous, indigenous, or traditional knowledges from non-Western worlds have often been demonized or presented as inferior, whilst at the same time appropriated to serve imperial powers and to claim white supremacy. Decoloniality of knowledge is founded on the recognition that there are multiple sources of knowledge apart from observation and reasoning, and these include intuitive knowledge, common sense, relational knowledge, creativity, and ethics. Coloniality of knowledge also highlights the importance of looking at the historicity of professions and disciplines. There may be noble reasons why a particular profession or discipline exists or was conceived of in the first place. However, when one begins to historicize professions or disciplines, one is likely to encounter baggage that these inherited when transplanted from one part of the world to another, or problems introduced by bowing too far towards interests beyond those pertaining to human, animal, and plant life. Livingstone's account on how colonial medicine made traditional ways of healing, seeing difference, and caring in Botswana redundant is a case in point. The construction of knowledge as only possible from some parts of the world, Europe and North America, and not others, Africa, for example, bears the consequence of rendering invisible or reducing as inferior those human beings that reside in these othered worlds. Decoloniality of being therefore entails reclaiming a sense of full humanness by the ex-colonized people in ways that recognize endogenous, indigenous, or traditional knowledges as worthy contributions to our global intellectual heritage. You might be asking by now, but what does this all have to do with occupational therapy? But if you accept that occupational therapy in its founding principles concerned itself with the full humanness of persons, then you also have to admit that coloniality of being must be a problem for the profession. If full humanness refers to a thinking and a knowledgeable being, then occupational therapy must have a problem with the framing of certain beings as incapable of thinking or less knowledgeable. In invoking cogito ergo sum, or I think, therefore I am, we ought to imagine the thinker as black, a woman, disabled, poor, and queer, along with other bodies they are, and not only hold a white man in our imagination. Please note that I use black here as an all-encompassing marker for bodies worldwide that continue to suffer oppression, primarily because of a healthy dose of melanin to their skin. But the profession of occupational therapy is even further implicated in this coloniality, decoloniality, quagmire, or conundrum by the fact that this thinking being, white, black, woman, man, disabled, rich, poor, heterosexual, or queer, is also a doer. Hagedorn saw this a long time ago when she was inspired to revise Descartes' cogito ergo sum into cogito et facto ergo sum, or I think and I make, therefore I am. Things become very interesting for occupational therapy when we begin to think about this doer in the context of coloniality. Are the intentions of this doer or doers to advance or to disrupt coloniality? How do doers know when it is that they're implicated in either direction of coloniality, except if they work on their own awareness or consciousness? I hope you already can see where I'm headed with this. Yes, I'm sure many of you guessed correctly. It is not by accident that occupational consciousness as a term in occupational science came about, and that it emerged from a place such as South Africa, which is still ravaged by the remnants of colonialism and apartheid. Occupational consciousness stresses the need to be vigilant as ex-colonized people about the ways in which we often sustain dominant practices through what we do every day, with implications for personal and collective health. Occupational consciousness highlights the need to adopt transgressive acts in what we do every day in order to disrupt the cycle of oppression and debility. The concept regards the current reality of Western modernity as a result of the legacy of coloniality seen through the ways in which the oppressed mimics the oppressor in order to be recognized. Coloniality of doing finds expression through mimicry, where the colonial subject responds to the civilizing mission by emulating the oppressor, even when this means denying the self ontological density, leading into debility. Decoloniality of doing, therefore, shifts decolonization from just being about discourse, but also reflexivity within everyday doing. if we speak of consciousness, we have to ask ourselves the following questions. What higher consciousness can we speak of other than one that guides us never to enslave, oppress, or abuse another human being, or think of them as less deserving of what we ourselves deem necessary to sustain life? Land, water, access to equitable health, and education. What do we mean when we say we are concerned about social justice if our consciousness does not stir us to fight for the equality of all human beings regarding these basic needs? I'm pleased that I asked these questions with good examples we can point to. And I would like to mention here critical developments in occupational therapy in Aotearoa, New Zealand. This is where our colleagues there have reframed key legislative documents to be directly accountable to Te Riti o Waitangi. These documents now commence with the contextual statement, and I quote, "The Te Riti o Waitangi is the founding document of Aotearoa, New Zealand. It shapes the diverse historical and socio-political realities of Maori and all other settlers and their descendants. Understanding how Te Riti affects all our lives is essential for helping people participate in their desired occupation. Such understanding helps occupational therapists see how systemic and individual issues can breach people's rights and limit their opportunities to participate in their chosen occupations." I close quote. I know my colleagues and friends, activists, occupational therapy practitioners, and scholars Jane Hopkick and Isla Emery Whittington played a critical role in having this contextual statement feature prominently in these legislative practice documents. I will now invite 3 voices from colleagues who are not occupational therapists to join this keynote address. These colleagues have something to say about our profession, informed by intersections between their professions and occupational therapy in South Africa. In the traditional sense, these colleagues are imbongis to our profession. Lana, you remember that, right? But instead of the now corrupted version of imbongis as praise singers of those in power and the political elite, here the imbongis not only give credit, but also offer some critique so that we as a profession and individuals within it may grow and can hold ourselves to account.
I think that occupational therapy is a perspective, or rather, let me put it differently. The occupational therapy that I've come to learn from my colleagues at UCT, and of course it's Elelwani and Roshan Khalfan, is an occupational therapy to which I'm deeply attracted. It's attractive for me because it's premised on the idea of capability, that people can do things.
As someone who was being trained at medical school, I came across occupational therapy quite early in my career. And I think what was very clear as to what it was apparently supposed to be doing was to take people who had things wrong with them, broken limbs, fix them, and then get them back to work. Unfortunately, what was very clear was those who were broken were actually working in pretty much dysfunctional circumstances. And in fact, those dysfunctional circumstances were designed by the system that actually continue to perpetuate ills of society. So what was then happening was, in fact, occupational therapy was colluding with the very same system. So take people who are broken by a broken system, fix them, send them back the same system to continue doing what they were doing. And in fact, the very same thing that they were doing, although it seemed helpful to them because they had employment, was actually increasing the inequality and sometimes deliberately working against what would have been the great values of society.
Before meeting Elelwani, I knew very little about occupational therapy. I had this sense that occupational therapy was something that was reserved for particular employees in the workplace, or for school children who go to particular schools where they have occupational therapists. And so something that's really quite inaccessible to most South Africans. And it's not until I met Elelwani and she came to give a series of lectures in my course, in my social psychology course, where I got a broader perspective on occupational therapy. And she came to talk about occupational consciousness. And in the space of 45 minutes of her giving a lecture in my class, suddenly, everyone had access to occupational therapy.
Occupational therapy was not what I was meant to think it was, but it could play a very different role, because what was important in what I've seen before was a system that was fueled initially by colonialism and then by coloniality and its power, where the power of that system lies pretty much in inducing an amnesia in a people, where they forget who they are and so adopt norms that don't actually define them as normality. Because, to be fair, at the center of occupational therapy is the idea of restoring functional wholeness, both the individual and society. And what happens is for one to actually define something as pathological, it's important to first define and understand what the normal looks like. But whose normal is it? And how does one know what normal is in a distorted society in which they've forgotten who they are? And so what that gives birth to is a system in which a post-colonial society that still has the whole impact of coloniality going through it starts defining what should be regarded as abnormal in it as normal, and vice versa, where what is normal is now regarded as abnormal. And it is here where I think the value of occupational therapy could be realized.
The troubling was to make the point that the body and the way in which the body works is not simply a medical question, that it has to do with the ways in which people learn how to manage themselves, the ways in which people are taught about what is acceptable in terms of how they work, how they should approach this question of doing things properly and so on. So that was a framework in this explanation of these different approaches to occupational therapy, which located occupational therapy firmly in the social, if you like, which I was very moved by, and it's remained with me.
One thing that stands out for me is this exercise that she gave the students. And what she did is she asked them a simple question, or a question that appears simple, which was, to think about something that they do every day that maintains their position of privilege in society. And that exercise sparked a range of conversations, some of which were things like, well, I drive to school or I drive to work, I hire a domestic worker. And the conversations led us to kind of think about, well, how do those things serve to maintain relations of power in society? So how is it that, when somebody is cleaning after you or cooking for you, it takes you away from doing things, activities that are intrinsically human?
In a way, I think occupational therapy needs to be rescued from its narrow mandate of just fixing limbs and sending it back into a dysfunctional world. But it should actually be crucial in defining a real holistic functional normal, devoid of the amnesia which has been induced by coloniality, where real values as we have probably inhabited them for centuries before colonialism came, can then be realized and be used to define the norm, and as a result be able to define pathology. And we'll probably be surprised to see that some of the things we've accepted as normal, we'll actually regard them as abnormal, as dysfunctional, because they are indeed in many ways dysfunctional. And I think here occupational therapy could, in a metaphorical way, maybe hold our hand and allow us to be led backwards into ourselves to discover who we really are. And I think that's quite important, to kind of knock this amnesia out of us as a society and as a post-colonial society that is carrying this burden of coloniality that we've regarded as now normal.
This concept of occupational consciousness, it kind of makes us aware and forces us to take some kind of responsibility for our position in society and for what we do in our environment. And in my view, this is revolutionary work. It is at the heart of decolonial work. And Elelwani has brought these ideas into the work of the Black Caucus. She's taught us that consciousness is an everyday process. So the importance of engaging together in protest activities, in drafting public statements, in social events, in networking, any type of activity that we do as a collective with the aim of challenging institutional racism at UCT, these types of things build our consciousness as a collective. We influence each other, we influence others, and it's the type of work that brings decolonial thinking into the institution. And I would definitely say that without Elelwani, BAC wouldn't be what it is today, and definitely UCT would not have decoloniality high on the agenda as it does today.
For me, probably best exemplified by the pilgrimage that Christopher Okibo makes in Labyrinth. And I think at the end of Distances, this great son of Africa, Christopher Okibo, says, "I have fed out of the drum, I have drunk out of the cymbal, I have entered your bridal chamber, and lo, I'm the sole witness to my homecoming." And that is the homecoming that I really hope that occupational therapy can wake up to realize is really intended destiny.
There's no doubt in my mind that this medley of three from our esteemed colleagues exemplify how occupational therapy is indeed well placed to advance decoloniality as healing work. A fourth example, not represented in the three voices you have just heard, comes from a collaboration with drama therapists Refilwe Lepere and Warren Nibi from Drama for Life, which is based at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. The collaboration has led to a recent publication in the journal Health Tomorrow, Interdisciplinarity and Internationality. The paper, which is titled Decolonizing Stigma and Diagnosis as Healing Work, argues that when stigma is addressed from both within and beyond the realm of medical diagnosis, and in ways that allow for a decolonial approach to health practice, research, and education, possibilities arise for reimagined subjectivities of difference that resist a reinscription of colonial unequal relations of power. Hearing voices, for example, need not mean schizophrenia or debility. Hearing voices becomes less one-dimensional, but more fluid, allowing for different possibilities for healing. From these four examples, the core message of affirmation for the profession is incredibly deep. It highlights our role in conscientizing not only individuals, but whole communities in ways that support them in reclaiming their full humanness and mobilizing their capabilities for self-determination and collective self-reliance and ultimately healing, such that healthy Mahdi, that is blood, flows from one generation to another. While the words may seem fuzzy at times, the work itself, as Dr. Shosekesi says, is revolutionary. And as I have personally learned, will not go unpunished. Coloniality finds reinscription into our lives by rewarding compliance and pliability. This is how, as a profession, we have found that our services are often recruited and gainfully rewarded when we help return the partially debilitated to some semblance of productive life in a sick society obsessed with Mahdi, as in money. We must therefore remain alert about what we are rewarded or celebrated for. And even as we theorize in ways that help us see human occupation in context with all its politics, we should take care not to theorize ourselves out of life itself, and in a language that remains out of grasp for those whose lives we are theorizing about. Colleagues, it's time to take a bow, as we should, aware that potential traps for reinscribing coloniality remain. In order to avoid these traps, we are reminded today that all what humanity seeks is a homecoming. On this continent, where all of humanity began, I am proud that as occupational therapists who remain deeply inspired by the founding principles of the profession, we are contributing towards this homecoming, investing in a more conscious Africa. May the next 100 years of occupational therapy see us protect these founding principles, never taking humanity for granted, but seeking intersections for decoloniality so that justice for all can be achieved.
I would sincerely like to thank Elelwani for an inspiring presentation, and I would like to congratulate Elelwani for her groundbreaking work.
Thank you. Thank you.
No, you can't. You can come and stand and have them all clap.